Hey everyone, today we're diving into the fascinating story of the Hebrew civilization, a group that played a massive role in shaping not just their own history, but also the rise of other major world religions like Christianity and Islam. Now the Hebrews, also known as the Israelites, were a Semitic people who practiced Judaism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. Their history, which is preserved in what we know as the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, means Old Testament if you follow the Christian tradition, is full of legendary figures, kings, prophets, and divine interventions. But here's where it gets really interesting. While many people consider these biblical stories to be completely accurate, historians and archaeologists have found some gaps in the accounts. That's not to say the stories are untrue, but rather they're likely more complex and layered than they first appear. So, let's take a closer look at how history and archaeology give us an even deeper understanding of this ancient civilization. The journey of the Hebrews begins with the famous patriarch Abraham, who's said to have been born around 2150 BCE in the ancient city of Ur, Mesopotamia. According to the Bible, at the age of 75, Abraham left Ur and traveled to Canaan, where his descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, began to take shape. Now, the catch here is, apart from the Bible, there's no archaeological evidence to back up the story of Abraham and his journey. Some scholars believe the stories about him were written much later, between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, meaning Abraham might be more of a symbolic figure than a historical one. Now let's jump to another big name. Joseph, one of Abraham's great-grandsons, who according to the Bible ended up in Egypt. His family joined him there, and over time, they were enslaved by the Egyptians. This is where Moses comes into the picture, a Hebrew child saved from a massacre, raised in Egyptian royalty, and eventually the leader who demanded freedom for his people. This epic tale of the Hebrews' escape from Egypt, known as the Exodus, is one of the Bible's most dramatic stories. But historians have hit a bit of a roadblock here because, once again, there's no clear archaeological evidence to confirm this grand exodus happened exactly as described. What does seem likely is that there was some kind of movement of people from Egypt to Canaan, but probably on a much smaller scale than the Bible's story of Moses and the parting of the Red Sea. Even Moses' name itself is Egyptian, which hints that he really may have come from Egypt. But the story of Joshua, who supposedly led the Hebrews in a conquest of Canaan, also lacks archaeological support, like the famous Battle of Jericho, for example. Still, over time, the Hebrews, or Israelites as they came to be called, did settle in Canaan. They organized themselves into a kingdom to defend against threats, especially from the Philistines. And this is where we meet the first kings of Israel, Saul, followed by David, and then Solomon. Now, this period is known as the United Monarchy, and it's considered a golden age in Hebrew history. David's reign was especially significant. He not only defeated the Philistines but also established Jerusalem as the capital. The Bible even mentions a House of David, and archaeologists actually found a reference to this in an ancient stone slab, giving some credence to his existence. His son, Solomon, is known for building the first temple in Jerusalem, though so far, there's no concrete archaeological evidence of this specific temple. After Solomon's death, things got more complicated. The kingdom split into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This led to new challenges, especially with the rise of the powerful Assyrian Empire. In 722 BCE, the Assyrians attacked and took over Israel, deporting thousands of Israelites. Judah, on the other hand, managed to survive for a while longer, though it was eventually conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, leading to the destruction of Jerusalem and the First Temple. During this exile in Babylon, many Israelites started to assimilate into the local culture, while others held tightly to their Jewish identity and religious traditions. It was during this time that many of the Hebrew scriptures were written down and compiled, giving shape to what we now know as the Hebrew Bible. Eventually, the Persians conquered Babylon, and in 538 BCE, King Cyrus allowed the exiled Jews to return home, leading to a period of rebuilding, both of their culture and their famous temple in Jerusalem. And now let's talk about how the Hebrews emerged and eventually formed a kingdom. But today, we're going to focus on their unique culture, especially their religion, which really set them apart from other ancient civilizations. One of the most striking features of Hebrew culture was their belief in only one God, what we call monotheism. According to the Bible, this all started with Abraham, who made a special covenant with Yahweh around 2100 BCE. But it wasn't until Moses came along that Hebrew monotheism really took shape. After the whole Exodus story, Moses received the laws directly from Yahweh, and one of the key commandments was that the Hebrews were only allowed to worship Yahweh, no other gods. This was a pretty big deal because at that time, most cultures were polytheistic, worshiping many gods. But here's where it gets interesting. While the Bible suggests that the Hebrews were strictly monotheistic from Moses onwards, it turns out the journey toward pure monotheism was a bit messier than that. For example, one of the commandments says, "Have no other gods before me," which kind of hints that there were other gods, just that the Hebrews weren't supposed to worship them. In fact, the Bible even describes God in the plural or as part of an assembly of gods in a few places, which points to some lingering polytheistic ideas from earlier Canaanite traditions. And that's not all. Archaeologists have found evidence, like temples and statues, that show the Hebrews were still worshipping other gods well into the 8th century BCE. Some of these deities include El, Baal, and Astarte, who were part of the broader Canaanite religious pantheon. There's even mention of Yahweh having a consort named Asherah, which might be surprising for those who think of ancient Hebrew religion as strictly monotheistic from day one. The Bible itself talks about how the Hebrews would sometimes stray from Yahweh and worship these other gods, only to be condemned for it later. This back and forth between monotheism and polytheism led to several reform movements throughout Hebrew history. One major reformer was King Hezekiah, who ruled Judah from 727 to 697 BCE. He launched a campaign to clean up religious practices by tearing down local shrines and getting rid of symbols of other gods. But then, his son Manasseh came along and restored some of those old traditions. This constant push and pull shows how the shift to pure monotheism wasn't an overnight thing, it was a gradual process. By the mid-7th century BCE though, the reformers had the upper hand. They promoted the idea that Yahweh alone should be worshipped, and that the laws of Moses were the key to maintaining the covenant with him. This interpretation of Hebrew history really took off during the Babylonian exile, when many of the core parts of the Hebrew Bible were edited and compiled. It was a time of reflection and renewal for the Hebrews, especially since they believed their earlier backsliding into polytheism was the reason for their suffering. After the exile, when the Judeans were allowed to return to Jerusalem, the foundation of Judaism as we know it was firmly in place. The Jews, as they were now called, since they came from Judah, were expected to live according to the laws of Moses. This included not only religious laws, like worshiping Yahweh and keeping the Sabbath, but also moral rules like prohibitions against murder, theft, and adultery. There were also specific dietary laws, such as avoiding pork and shellfish, and rules about how animals should be slaughtered for food. Many of these laws actually came from the Hebrews' early agricultural roots. For instance, the festival of Sukkot, or the Festival of Huts, was a harvest festival that commemorated their time as farmers. Even though the Hebrews eventually became city dwellers, many of these traditions were kept alive in a symbolic way. As they moved into urban life, especially in places like Jerusalem, they found new roles as craftsmen, merchants, and traders. The heart of this urban religious life was the temple in Jerusalem, which was rebuilt around 515 BCE after the Babylonian exile. This temple was the center of worship, and it included large courtyards and sacred spaces like the Holy of Holies, where Yahweh was believed to dwell. Priests led festivals and performed rituals, including animal sacrifices, to maintain the covenant with Yahweh.